There's an old joke that German drivers used to tell in the late 1960s. Translated, it goes something like this. How did the Volkswagen 411 get its name? Finally, a Beetle with 4 doors, 11 years too late. It sounds like a throwaway line, the kind of thing you'd forget within a minute. It isn't. That joke is the entire story of the biggest gamble Volkswagen ever made, and the quiet failure that followed it. By 1968, Volkswagen was selling more than 1 million Beetles a year. The company was rich. It was confident. And it was completely dependent on a single shape the whole world could recognize from 100 yards away, in almost any country on Earth. But inside the factory walls in Wolfsburg, something uncomfortable was becoming obvious to the people running the company. The Beetle couldn't carry Volkswagen forever. Buyers were growing up, earning more, starting families, wanting something bigger than a car designed decades earlier for a very different world. Volkswagen needed to prove it could build a real family car, not just a cheap, clever one. What you're about to hear is how that ambition turned into one of the most misunderstood cars the company ever produced, and why almost nobody remembers it today. Volkswagen's advertising for this new model leaned hard into that ambition. The slogan splashed across early adverts announced the company had built the big one from Wolfsburg, with follow-up campaigns insisting that some things are simply built better than the rest. It wasn't subtle. This was Volkswagen telling the world, loudly, that it could compete outside the small car segment it had dominated for 2 decades. The project actually started 6 years earlier, in 1962, under an internal code name, EA-142. The man steering it was Heinrich Nordhoff, the same executive who had rebuilt Volkswagen from rubble after the war and turned the Beetle into a global phenomenon almost single-handedly. Nordhoff wanted a car for buyers who had outgrown the Beetle but weren't ready to leave the brand behind. He'd already tried once before, launching the Type 3 in 1961, a slightly larger car sold as the 1500. It helped, but it was still built on Beetle bones underneath. Nordhoff wanted something with genuinely new engineering underneath it this time. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, though. Nordhoff never lived to see it. He died in the spring of 1968, months before his creation ever reached a single dealership floor. The man who dreamed up Volkswagen's most ambitious car never got to sit behind the wheel of one that customers could actually buy. Sit with that for a second. 6 years of planning, and the man who started it all missed the finish line by months. The car finally launched at the Paris Motor Show in October of 1968. It reached German dealers on October the 5th of that year, following an internal presentation to the company back in July and a dealer preview event in Braunschweig just before the public unveiling. They called it the 411, and it wasn't just another model rolling off the line. It was Volkswagen's largest, most expensive, most technically serious car to date. And under the skin, it was genuinely different from anything the company had ever built before. For the first time ever, a Volkswagen used a unibody structure instead of a separate body-on-frame chassis. For the first time ever, Volkswagen offered a proper 4-door sedan, alongside a 2-door version for buyers who wanted something sportier. The front suspension used a McPherson strut design paired with coil springs, and the marketing brochures of the day proudly compared the setup to what you'd find underneath a Porsche 911, built with an emphasis on stability rather than outright speed. That wasn't just an empty marketing boast either. The styling itself carried real input from Pininfarina, the Italian design house behind some of the most desirable sports cars ever built in Europe, which held an advisory contract with Volkswagen at the time. The company rarely gets credit for that connection today, but it's true, and it tells you exactly how seriously Volkswagen was taking this project. There were also paths Volkswagen quietly chose not to take. Coach builder Karmann, the same company behind the beloved Karmann gear, actually built a convertible prototype based on the 411 that same year. It never reached production. Engineers also experimented with a notchback sedan variant that likewise stayed locked away as a one-off. Small detours like these rarely make it into the official history, but they show a company still figuring out exactly how far it wanted to push this new platform before committing fully. There's one more piece of context worth knowing here, because it says a lot about Volkswagen's strategy at the time. Back in 1964, Volkswagen had quietly acquired Auto Union, the company that would eventually become Audi. And in that very same year the 411 launched, 1968, Audi was developing its own upper-middle-class car in parallel, the Audi 100, which debuted that same year. Two divisions of the same growing company, racing toward the same market segment from two different directions at almost exactly the same moment. Now, picture yourself walking into a dealership in 1968, ready to spend real money on the future of your family's transportation. You'd have found a 5-seat sedan with a 570-liter boot, a completely flat passenger floor, a standard parking heater running off a thermostat, and draft-free air circulation that Volkswagen marketed as a genuine luxury feature. The front seats reclined fully and adjusted 6 different ways. Safety wasn't an afterthought either. The car came with front and rear crumple zones, a padded instrument panel, and a collapsible steering column years before that became standard practice across the industry. Under the rear deck sat an air-cooled flat-4 engine, displacing 1,679 cubic centimeters, producing 68 horsepower through twin carburetors, sending power to the rear wheels through a semi-trailing arm rear suspension. Prices ranged from around 7,770 German marks up to 9,285 marks, depending on trim level. That was serious money at the time, aimed squarely at buyers who wanted noticeably more car than a Beetle could ever offer them. None of that spending happened by accident. Every stitched seat, every reinforced steering column, every extra inch of headroom was part of a deliberate pitch to a buyer Volkswagen had never really sold to before. Someone cross-shopping against Ford and Opel in the German midsize market, not someone simply looking for the cheapest way to get 4 wheels under their family. Here's the number that shows just how much confidence Volkswagen had riding on this thing. Internal projections called for selling 822,500 units over 4 years, with daily production running at a full 1,000 cars. That's not a modest side project you quietly test in one market. That's a company betting its future on breaking out of the Beetle's shadow for good, publicly and permanently. Before we get to what actually happened to that bet, if you're enjoying learning the real story behind these old machines, the details most car channels skip right past, take a second to subscribe to this channel. It genuinely helps keep content like this coming, and it means you won't miss the next one when it drops. Drop a comment telling me the year, or the number, that surprised you most so far. And if this story is pulling you in, give it a like too. It helps more than you'd think. Now, back to 1968, because what happened next is where this story really turns. Here's what almost nobody tells you about the 411. Despite all that engineering ambition, more than 80% of the people who actually bought one were already Volkswagen owners. Think carefully about what that number means. The entire point of this car, the whole 6-year development effort, was to pull in new customers, people who had never owned a Volkswagen before in their lives. Instead, the 411 mostly just reshuffled the company's own existing buyers into a bigger, more expensive box. The car built specifically to expand Volkswagen's reach barely moved the needle outside its own loyal base of customers. Here's the part that stings the most if you think about it from Volkswagen's side. This wasn't a company cutting corners or rushing a half-finished product out the door to chase a trend. Engineers had spent 6 careful years on this car. They'd genuinely borrowed ideas from Porsche's suspension playbook. They'd brought in one of Italy's most respected design houses. They'd built in safety features most manufacturers weren't even thinking about yet. And still, none of it was enough to change how the public felt the moment they actually got behind the wheel. And it got worse before it got better. Early production cars suffered from clutch problems straight out of the factory, the kind of defect that destroys word of mouth fast. The press, which had greeted the car warmly right up to launch, turned noticeably colder once real-world complaints started rolling in from actual owners. People griped about engine noise and road noise intruding into a cabin that was supposed to feel upscale. And then there was the face of the car itself. The rounded front end, housing the spare tire beneath it, earned an unflattering nickname back home, Nassenbar, the German word for coati. That long-snouted raccoon relative found wandering through Central and South America. Not exactly the image Volkswagen wanted stamped onto its new flagship model. The sales numbers told the real story, no matter how the brochures tried to spin it. At certain points, Volkswagen actually slowed production down to just 75 cars a day, a quiet admission that demand simply wasn't matching ambition. Volkswagen did try to fix things. In 1969, the improved 411e arrived, running Bosch electronic fuel injection and pushing power up to 80 horsepower, along with a facelifted front end that swapped the original single oval headlights for twin round units, plus a new rear stabilizer bar for flatter, more neutral handling. A two-door estate version called the Variant joined the lineup that same year, and remarkably, it actually outsold the standard sedan by roughly 2-to-1, almost immediately. Volkswagen even exported the car to America starting in 1971, where it performed better than most expected, eventually accounting for around 40% of total sales for the model. But none of that was ever enough to change the bigger picture waiting at the end of the story. Volkswagen kept tweaking the formula right up until the end, hoping something would finally click with buyers. In August of 1973, for the 1974 model year, engineers pushed the engine out to 1,795 cubic centimeters and actually reverted from fuel injection back to a twin carburetor setup, splitting the lineup into a standard 412 producing 75 horsepower and a higher output, 412S, making 85 horsepower on premium fuel. Production had already shifted away from the main Wolfsburg plant by this point, and by June of 1974, the line shut down for good. What replaced it tells you everything about where Volkswagen's future actually lay. Within a couple of years, the Passat, the Scirocco, and the Golf arrived, all front-engined, all water-cooled, all built on a completely different philosophy than the one the 411 had tried to defend. By the time production finally ended in 1974, following a 1972 facelift by designer Brooks Stevens that renamed the car the 412 and added halogen headlights, Volkswagen had built a combined total of 367,728 units across 6 full years. Now compare that number to the car that effectively replaced it, the K70, which sold 210,082 units in just 4 years, a shorter production run that still comfortably outpaced the 411 and 412's entire 6-year lifespan combined. And compare it to the Beetle, still rolling out at over 1 million units every single year, the entire time this supposedly modern successor was struggling just to find its footing in showrooms. There's a strange kind of dignity buried in all of that failure, though, and it's worth pausing on before we move to the ending. Despite everything going against it, the 411 and 412 hold a genuine place in Volkswagen's history books as the last large series production Volkswagen to keep the air-cooled, rear-mounted engine layout that had defined the brand since the Beetle first rolled out decades earlier. Production wasn't limited to Germany either. Volkswagen of South Africa built the car locally from 1969 through 1974, adding over 34,000 units to the global total, with slightly different trim and equipment suited to that market. This wasn't some forgotten footnote confined to one factory floor. It was a genuinely international effort, right up until the very end of its run. Today, the physical evidence of that struggle has almost entirely vanished. Poor rust protection, steep early depreciation, and a chronic shortage of spare parts wiped out most surviving cars decades ago. By around 2010, researchers tracking German vehicle registrations counted roughly 380 examples of the 411 and 412 combined, still on the road. A car that was meant to be Volkswagen's proud statement to the entire world has quietly become one of its rarest survivors, sitting in the shadow of the very model it was built to escape in the first place. But here's where this story earns a proper ending, and it's not nearly as bleak as it sounds so far. The engine developed for the 411 didn't disappear the moment the car did. That same air-cooled flat-4 engine went on to power later versions of Volkswagen's Type 2 van, the vehicle most people today know simply as the classic combi bus. And in an even more surprising twist, an upgraded, larger displacement version of that very engine found its way into the Porsche 914 and the Porsche 912e, genuine sports cars wearing one of the most respected badges in the automotive world. The technology that couldn't save the 411 from being forgotten ended up quietly living on inside machines that collectors still chase and restore with pride today. Think about that for a moment. A car engineered to save Volkswagen from being a one-trick company ended up, in the strangest possible way, saving parts of itself by hiding inside other machines entirely. The combi buses that carried surfers and families across continents for years afterward, and the Porsches that collectors pay serious money for today, both owe a quiet debt to a sedan most people can't even picture in their heads anymore. So, what does the story of the 411 actually teach us, sitting here decades later? Sometimes, the engineering genuinely isn't the problem. Sometimes a company builds something well-made, honestly innovative, ahead of its time in real, measurable ways, and the market simply refuses to let go of what it already loves. Volkswagen had built its entire public identity around one small, round, instantly recognizable car, and customers weren't ready to see the brand as anything else. No matter how good the engineering underneath turned out to be, the 411 wasn't a bad car. It was the right car, built at the wrong moment, for a public that simply wasn't willing to change its mind about Volkswagen just yet. If this kind of story means something to you, the ones that get quietly buried underneath the more famous names everyone already knows, do 3 things for me right now, before you move on to the next video. Subscribe to this channel so you genuinely don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell me what stuck with you the most. Maybe that joke about the 11-year-late Beetle, or the fact that Nordhoff never lived to see his own creation on the road at all. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story like this, someone who remembers cars like this one from back in the day, go ahead and share it with them right now. These stories deserve to be remembered properly, and that only ever happens if we keep telling them together, one video at a time.